What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about PointClear Solutions so that you know, have some idea why we feel like we're qualified to talk about user experience. But PointClear Solutions is a Atlanta-based healthcare software development firm that builds transformative technologies. But one of the things that makes PointClear Solutions different is we have an exceptional user experience expertise. Now, we develop software end to end from idea all the way to implementation, but one of our core differences is our user experience team led by Lee Farabaugh, our Chief Experience Officer. So we focus on user-centered design, and which we feel increases user adoption, and so you'll hear more about that as we go through that. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about our two presenters today. As I mentioned before, Lee Farabaugh is our Chief Experience Officer. She's got over 10 years in healthcare UX experience, including public health experience with the CDC, and a lot of time with provider-facing applications and patient engagement as well. She specializes in UX strategy to help achieve organizational goals, improve the market competitiveness, and that kind of stuff. But she also has deep personal experience in web development and graphic design, which you'll hear about today. Raelynn O'Leary is a senior user experience and visual designer for PointClear, and she's got 8 years experience creating aesthetically appealing design solutions that are simple and intuitive to use. And she has a special interest in information visualization, if you're familiar with that term. We welcome both of you ladies, and so Lee, if you would pick it up from here.
Thank you, Chris. So Raelynn and I recently published a white paper discussing the differences between the concept of visual design and user experience design, because we get a lot of requests from potential clients to improve UI through visual design alone. And to us, it's difficult, if not impossible, to update visual styling without also considering user experience. It's just sort of in our blood. We want to understand, is the system solving a problem that's important for users, and is it doing so in an intuitive manner? To us, updating visual styling only buys so much if the user experience foundation itself is flawed or if it has deficiencies. In fact, the way we feel is that visual design differs from user experience design in that it is actually a component of an overall user experience design. It should be considered along with user research and interaction design to craft a user experience that is useful, usable, and appealing. When a design is based on just one of these facets, it's going to fall down in other areas. So to illustrate this further, let's look at a few examples. Sagrada Familia is a Roman Catholic church in Barcelona, Spain, that I've been to and Chris has as well. The Catalan architect Antoni Gaudí is responsible for its architecture and engineering style. However, the church itself is still under construction, and that it's over 100 years since after Gaudí began working on it, and is tentatively scheduled for completion on the centennial of his death, which is in 2026. It's a complex and complicated design, and it serves currently as a tourist site, but it still can't function as a church because it's still not complete due to the complexity of its design and the expense of its construction. While it's beautiful, at least in some estimations, it's not very useful in terms of its original intention. Next, let's look at Audi.com, and specifically the vehicle configurator. You can tell that this design embodies many of the classic hallmarks of a good visual design. It's got a consistent use of fonts in various weights and sizes to draw attention, and obviously there's plenty of white space. But as a car buyer, how can I tell the difference between the $40,000 model and the $49,000 model? There's no information to sell me on the features of the more expensive model, so I'm left to wonder, or I have to navigate to a different area of the website to find out the standard features for each model. And once I choose a model, presumably without a whole lot of good information on why I would make that decision, I'm then presented with a visual image of the vehicle, but nothing else. So there's a couple buttons, as you can see on the right, that sort of fall off the edge of my screen, and there's some hotspots on the car, presumably to tell or show me something more about it, but it's really not clear what I should do next. If I scroll down, if I were actually in a web browser and I could scroll down, you would see that I can see the exterior colors and interior colors, features, and standard specs, but I would never know that from this view. Beautiful, yes. Easy to use, not so much. And now let's look at an example that's perhaps more whimsical than beautiful, but I think we can all agree it has limited utility. For your next camping trip, consider the bear sleeping bag, or maybe not. For one, it seems like it might be hard to breathe with the jaws closed. And what if your tent mate wakes up in the middle of the night, disoriented, and sees a bear sleeping next to him? Your life could be in danger. And finally, we've all seen those beautiful catalog photos of rooms that look amazing but would be impossible to live in. These plants are certainly a conversation piece hanging upside down, and they provide loads of visual interest. But how would you water them? And how would the dirt stay in? These examples show us that it's not enough just to consider how a product looks. It also has to serve a real need and function well for the person using it. As we can see, aesthetics alone do not ensure a good product.
So we've said that aesthetics alone don't make a good product, but at the same time, visual design is not just about aesthetics. So the decisions that we make about layout, color, iconography, and those kinds of elements can actually make a system easier to use. And the way that it looks and feels can engage and communicate with an audience and build their trust. Let's talk about usability first. So there's much in the way of what visual design can do to increase the usability of an application. No matter how much we try and simplify, we're often working with really data-heavy systems that are complex and have lots of different layers of information. And so once we determine an application's hierarchy, how we treat that visually can affect whether the user knows where they are in the system at any given time and how to navigate to where they want to go. And then, after we visually consider the navigation, we also need to consider how to use color, layout, and graphics to draw the user's eye to the most important or most pertinent information, to show them where they need to look on any given screen. So let's take this example of a Wave Accounting. This is a free small business accounting app that obviously looks very nice. And just at a glance, it's really easily apparent how the app is organized and what's being shown on the screen based on how the primary navigation is laid out, the blue navigation down the left side of the page. Those large icons are used throughout the interface as indications of where the user is in the system. And then the secondary navigation is clearly that. It's secondary. So you see how it's contained within that gray primary content area on the right and delineated by those tabs. And then beyond just the navigation, in terms of where this interface draws my eye, once I'm oriented and I know where I am, I'm immediately drawn to the fact that I've got two tasks that are overdue based on those red flags. And then the main action on the page, which is create an invoice, is very clear and apparent based on how they've treated that button. So a second aspect of usability is legibility. And in order to make an application legible, we need to start by selecting an appropriate typeface that's easy to read on a screen. And then we need to use that typeface at the appropriate size and with an appropriate line length and present the content in an effective layout that's utilizing enough white space so that the user can actually read and digest the information. So, another example from Wave Accounting, this is a relatively complex table of transactions. It could be, potentially quite overwhelming. There's horizontal stripes, which may or may not be coming through clearly in the webinar, but there's sort of zebra stripes, alternating gray and white stripes that help the user read all the way across the table row. The type is an appropriate size for legibility. No one would argue that this is difficult to read, and the information is not too crowded. And then the way that we've treated typographically the formatting of each column makes it such that you can sort of scan this table and pull out important information. You wouldn't even need to have a header row in order to do so. And next, learnability. So we can use visual design cues to help users learn what to expect from an application. And we do this by developing a hierarchy of elements and a consistent set of styles or treatments, and then taking those and applying them consistently throughout the interface. And if we do so, a user is going to come to learn how the information is organized. And if they know how the information is organized, and if they learn how the system works, this will ensure that anytime they interact with the system, they're going to get the expected outcome. So, for example, again, speaking about text treatment and text styles, you'll notice how throughout this application, titles, body copy, the text that's in the form fields, it's all treated the same way. And then when I enter data into the screen at the left, the row is highlighted in gray, and I see a series of white fields. And then when I look at the table on the right, and I put one of these rows in edit mode, it looks and also behaves the same way as the table row that's in edit mode at the left. This seems very intuitive, but it really comes across when the system isn't consistent and doesn't behave as expected, we find that people get tripped up. And finally, we can visually address the feedback that a system gives to a user and make it visible, more easily understood, and actionable. So we can use iconography, color, and other visual cues to instruct the user on how to use the system, and then also to give them actionable steps to take when the system is not meeting their expectations. And then beyond just system feedback, we can also use visual clues to clue the user in on characteristics of the data. So we often use color encoding to let the user know when a data threshold has been met, or we use icons to indicate when a data element is really high priority. So notice here again in the wave system, they're using all cap type treatment and also the orange and yellow color to alert the user that there are new important features in the system. And then the blue shaded area with the eye icon, this consistently in both of these screens and throughout the system provides the users with instruction for how to use it. And then on the bottom screen, the customer field, that customer dropdown is clearly delineated as required based on that red asterisk. And when an error occurs, in this case, no match is found, that state is communicated to me clearly and very visibly in a red contrasting color, so that as a user, I have an opportunity to go back and restructure my query and take an action. So we've talked about usability, but not only can visual design help make an application easier to use, it can also make it easier for users to trust your application. And I think it's well known that building a brand is important in establishing customer trust. What a solid brand can do is enable someone to walk into a room, see an application up in a browser window on a screen, recognize it first, and then feel confident about using it because they trust the organization and the brand behind it. And I'm sure we've all experienced using applications that look like they don't really have any connection at all to the company that developed them. We can use visual design to propagate the brand throughout the application. For example, here's one of our client applications where we've worked really hard to maintain the brand look and feel from the marketing site, and then as the user logs in or registers to use the system, all the way through to when they work with the application itself on a day-to-day basis. It looks like it is all from the same organization and can help a user trust that it's going to work in a trustworthy manner. And then finally, engagement. So we've all experienced an interface that's ugly. It can be intimidating, and sometimes it can be a barrier to even using an application at all. But on the other hand, an application that feels beautiful can actually draw you in and accentuate its simplicity. So again, that application UI that we used before, in contrast with an application on the right that we've developed for one of our clients, both of these applications are really complex and trying to convey a lot of data, a lot of information with a lot of jumping off points. But you can see how a user might be intimidated by one of these and happy and confident to use the other.
Thanks, Raelynn. So now that we've seen how visual design can do so much more than just make an interface look good, let's talk about the fact that good visual design overlaps, involves, and borrows from the larger user experience methodology. And in fact, it's intrinsically integrated in this methodology when it's given its due. Most people know that user experience methodology involves research, and this is certainly true in terms of interviews and observational studies with actual users to understand how they currently solve problems at hand. But research is important throughout the project, as you can see here, in terms of testing the usability, effectiveness, and learnability of interaction designs and the visual elements of the interface. The personas that are created typically as a result of initial research activities can help the design team understand the breadth of the various audience types they need to test their designs with. And then wireframes and prototypes purposely lack visual design elements so that people looking at them can focus on page layout, placement and proximity of text and controls, and interaction between screens and screen states. These wireframes and prototypes can be tested with actual users who can provide valuable insight regarding the design strengths and weaknesses. Then these kinds of designs are tweaked and refined based on that feedback, and this iterative approach ensures that the designs are optimized to meet the precise needs of the target audience. Visual design works the same way. We can iterate on visual design elements as well, just in the same way that we do with wireframes and prototypes. And again, testing with those different audiences helps us to understand which sort of visual elements are working and which ones are not.
So we just showed you this integrated methodology. However, traditionally, for one reason or another, visual design hasn't always been included in the UX process. As we talked about earlier, sometimes visual design just comes in at the end to put a spin on things, and often it's, it's left out altogether. But we know that when it is included in the process, the outcomes are better. So I want to talk about some ways to ensure that visual design is fully integrated into the UX process. And the first thing that we can do is work on understanding the brand from an outset of a project. And this is more than just getting a set of brand guidelines and reading through them, but really understanding the brand voice and then including the gatekeepers of the brand, which are often the marketing folks, the product people. Including them from a project's conception allows us to iterate on the look and feel throughout the design process so that the end product really communicates and reflects the brand in a very refined fashion. And then we don't want to create high fidelity comps too soon. So we need to be sure we spend adequate time exploring user workflows and refining the features and the interactions of a system before we jump to high fidelity screen comps. And we just talked about how visual and interaction design really needs to be intertwined and iterative together. But at the same time, it's a lot less time-consuming and expensive to modify sketches and wireframes than it is to change beautifully designed pixel-perfect screen comps. And then sometimes when we show something that's too finished and too elegantly designed to users throughout that iteration process, it might discourage them from providing really creative suggestions around how the design can continue to evolve. Next, start visual design activities early. So I know this sounds contrary to what I just said, which is don't create high fidelity comps too soon. But even as early as strategy and the requirements gathering phase, there are visual design activities that we can start. And starting those things early increases our ability to refine the visual design over time. For example, we can begin things like sketching icons that work with the brand and also communicate the information effectively. And we can start to sketch screen layouts and explore visual treatments for imagery and infographics. All of these things can be started well before the first high fidelity screen comp is created. And then those things, those visual design sketches and icons and those things that we start to work on early in the process, we should test them with users just like we test whether they can complete workflows and complete their tasks. All along the way, we can continue to evaluate and refine the visual design. So what kind of feedback can we get about visual design from users? Again, we can get the feedback in the same two camps that we talked about earlier, usability and engagement. When we think about how a visual design can contribute to the usability of the application and whether we're doing that effectively, we want to know, are the users looking where we want and need them to? Are we using the right visual cues to draw their eyes to the right place at the right time? We want to know, is the content legible? Have we chosen the right typeface? And are we using it at the right size so that I can scan a page and pull out important information? We use color encoding a lot in visual design, and we want to make sure that our colors are actually conveying their intended meaning. We want to make sure that icons are clear, and also it's important that the symbols and the graphics that we use fit the domain in which the user is oriented so that they match their mental models. This is an example of a project where we gathered user feedback around an information visualization, which ended up being the centerpiece of a system that we designed. And we came up with a range of visualizations very early on in the process, and then took these to users to see which ones were reflective of the types of visualizations they're already working with on a day-to-day basis. And then we tried to evaluate if any of these are different than what they were used to, are any of them better? And then we took a real hard look at color. And we wanted to know whether red and green to indicate metrics of high or low performance were too harsh. We didn't want hurt feelings, and we also didn't want people to overreact based on the visualization and what it was trying to convey. And at the same time, we evaluated alternative color codings, like, for example, orange and blue. That's not the mainstream way that we encode high and low performance, but is it clear, or is that actually too abstract? We tested whether large numeric values actually helped or hindered what the visualization was trying to convey. And you know, there were a whole host of other types of feedback that we were able to get. Sometimes we just got feedback on visual appeal, so which of these looks more compelling to a user. And this early and iterative way of working with the visual design allowed us to build a system that we were then able to apply across the interface, and that whole system was based on concepts that were thoroughly vetted with users. Now that we know how to test visual design in terms of how it contributes to a system's usability, we don't want to forget that we can also evaluate whether a visual design is helping the user feel emotions that are reflective of the brand and that are appropriate to the context in which the software lives. So for example, a hospital's website should make a prospective patient feel confident and positive about their decision to go with a hospital system. And an application built for nurses needs to make a nurse feel organized and less overwhelmed, because we know that they're navigating a whole host of daily tasks and trying to provide care for a lot of different people, sometimes in a high-stress environment. So just to recap, we're familiar with the process of evaluating a design with real people and iterating on it based on user feedback. That's one of the core tenets of the user experience design process. And as we illustrated, this evaluation should take into consideration not only how an application works, but also how it looks, and therefore how the visual design affects both usability and user engagement.
Thanks, Raelynn. So I hope this has been helpful and informative to everyone, and that you've gotten a little bit more of a broad view of what visual design is and how it plays within the larger user experience methodology. So what we've seen today is that, you know, a great interface is more than just something that's beautiful. It's something that solves a real problem and functions efficiently and effectively, as well as being appealing and engaging. And that visual design, you know, so much of the time we think of it just as pretty pictures or pretty graphics, but it actually has a tremendous effect on an interface. It has a lot to do with how usable the interface is, and how engaging it is, and how much people actually trust it. And then, as we've seen through looking at the process, the user experience design process is most effective when all of these components, usefulness, usability, and visual design, work together in an iterative fashion to inform each other. And if you'd like to know any more, you can check out our white paper, which is available at pointclearsolutions.com on our resources page. So now we're ready for questions and answers.
Okay, so I've got one here, Lee or Raelynn. I don't know who will take this question,
okay.
But somebody says, you mentioned that the user experience process should include user research, interaction design, and visual design. On an ideal team, who's performing these functions?
So I can start with that one, and then Raelynn, see if you have any feedback you'd like to add. I think on an ideal team, it's multiple people, and the reason for that is twofold. Usually those skills don't all live in one person. It's rare if you can find someone who is not only great at research and interaction design, but also has those visual design skills. I mean, being really good at visual design takes a lot of practice. But also that on an ideal team, you want to be able to bring in as many perspectives as you can. So if you have someone who's performing their research activities, they might be doing the interaction design work, but certainly you'll have someone who's doing visual design work in addition to those other two. It really brings a nice cross-section of ideas, and you know, oftentimes people hear different things, so if all three of those people are sitting in on a user research session, they're going to pick up on different things that people say.
Yeah, I'll follow on. I think that, you know, there are situations where it is a single person who has all of those proficiencies, but then, like Lee said, often it's important to have individuals with very deep proficiency in one of those areas come together and collaborate. I think the biggest point is to make sure that those three proficiencies are always at the table, regardless of the team composition.
Another question we have is, how about other disciplines often considered to be included in UX, such as analytics, content strategy, and information architecture?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, those other disciplines that you mentioned are all also very important, and you know, they have a place within the UX methodology just like visual design does, or just like research does. You know, they were sort of outside the realm of our white paper and thus of the topic of today. we wrote that white paper specifically to answer that question. People often say, can you just reskin this? Can you just make it look pretty? But those components that you mentioned, analytics, content strategy, and information architecture, are all also integral. I mean, especially if you're designing an application or a website where there's a lot of information, the navigation model, how you structure that information, and then, Raelynn can chime in here, but how you do information design. So how are you using font and styling and color to let people know something's a title, something's body content, and then, content strategy, of course, comes in terms of how long is the information, is it the right size for reading on the web, the right amount, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's all really important too.
And I think we may have abstracted a little bit just for the sake of this discussion, certainly. We could tie strategy in with what we effectively called user research, or just sort of understanding user needs. And as Lee mentioned, information architecture is sort of a piece of interaction and visual design that actually touches on both of those disciplines and pulls them together to convey information architecture in an easy to understand fashion. So I think absolutely there's no question that those are all integral parts of the user experience process. And if we wanted to come up with a model or a good sort of explanation of the user experience process, that would be a whole webinar on its own. I think we've sort of simplified a little bit and could effectively roll those different disciplines up under the other things that we focused on today.
Great. Next question. Would it ever make sense to hire an experienced designer as a user researcher?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would caveat that by saying that if you hired an experienced designer who did not have a background in user research, you would certainly want that person to be able to learn about that skill set and practice it. It's just like visual design. Research is something that you can get good at through practice. But I would assume that most experienced designers would also have some knowledge or some interest in user research. I heard a saying the other day, and I can't remember who to attribute it to, but it went like this: you can't call it user research, or I'm sorry, you can't call it user experience if you don't talk to users. So anyone who says they're an experienced designer, I would hope, is certainly at least interested in experienced research, user research.
Somebody frames up a comment this way: right now I'm having our front-end developers do the wireframing while our graphic designers do the actual visual design. So my issue is sometimes our clients do not appreciate wireframes compared to actual mock-ups with design. Do you think we can solve this?
It's certainly something that everyone struggles with. And I think there are a lot of different approaches to solving that problem. Of course, a lot of it is educating clients about the value of the wireframing process, and like we talked about earlier, how that enables us to work really iteratively, really quick and closely and collaboratively without getting into some of the really expensive pixel pushing that goes behind creating really high fidelity things. But there's also a fine line. There are always people out there that cannot envision something until it looks more real. And I don't say that as a criticism. I think that we need to be doing our job to help those people envision as well. And I think there are different ways to go about this. Sometimes it could be in creating a full set of wireframes and then just visually designing a subset of screens so that they can understand and make the leap between the wireframes and the visual design. Other times it's working with a lot of those early sketches around things like buttons and icons of typographic treatment, so they start to get a sense of how this is going to feel without actually doing a fully fleshed out design. So I think it's a combination of educating people about what wireframes are and what their purpose is, and then giving them enough, the appropriate amount of the vision, sort of without going out and visually designing every screen in the system.
Okay. The next question we have is, does user research have to be expensive? What are the ways to make it more budget friendly?
Yeah, so it does not have to be expensive. There's a lot of ways to make it more budget friendly. One of the best resources on this is a gentleman named Jakob Nielsen. I think it's Nielsen, and he came up with this concept of budget usability, and reading him would be a lot more informative than anything I could tell you in the short time we have here. But some of the things that he suggests are testing with a small set of users, like 5 people. You can get tons of great insight from a small set. And then also, instead of blowing all of your budget on one big test, do a lot of testing of your designs, your wireframes, and your visuals as you go through the process. Another thing that I have to say to that question is that, just as Raelynn mentioned before a second ago, you know, wireframes are an inexpensive way to work out design problems versus visual design, and so that's another way that you can save your budget. But also, I think, kind of based on the previous question, it's important to infuse them together, because you want to vet a lot of your visual concepts as well. But you can certainly do it. You can push pixels a little cheaper in a wireframe than you can in a visual design.
Do you have a preferred wireframing tool or process?
I'll answer, and then I'll let Raelynn answer, because she has a different one. I tend to use a tool called OmniGraffle. I work on the Mac, and OmniGraffle is a Mac-based tool. Part of it is because I've just used it for a long time and I'm really fast in it. So, you know, that's just one of the reasons I like using it. But that doesn't mean it's the only one. And then for prototyping, I like Axure. And again, I think a lot of it's what you get used to. But I know Raelynn gets frustrated with me when I try to draw an OmniGraffle. So let's see what she has to say.
Well, and I think it comes from the fact that I happen to be one of those people that comes from a visual design background that has evolved into working in both interaction and visual design. So I personally like the flexibility that the Adobe products like InDesign and Illustrator afford me in the wireframing process. I think that, you know, because I can't divorce myself from the fact that visual design increases usability, my wireframes tend to be pretty well considered in terms of things like layout and hierarchy and all of those visual components that we just talked about. So those Adobe products like Illustrator and InDesign really afford that level of fidelity, but where they fall down is, like Lee mentioned, in their ability to sort of export and make clickable PDFs and prototyping and things like that.
Thank you. Next question. Is there a specific development process you use, i.e. Agile or Waterfall, and why?
So most of the time, because we do consultative work with clients, we adapt to the process that they use. So we typically use a different process depending on the project. You know, if our client is working in an iterative environment or an agile environment or a waterfall environment, we can adapt. And I think it's a whole separate webinar, but you know, Agile has its own issues with user experience. It's really tough to integrate user experience into a traditional Agile sprint cycle. You have to work sort of crazy fast ahead of the developers and crazy fast behind them. So I'm not really answering your question, but what I would say is that the process that probably best fits what we do is more of an iterative process, not so rigidly Agile, but certainly not waterfall, because you know, with waterfall, by the time you get to the end, so many things have changed.
Gotcha. Somebody says, well, is there ever a case where just skinning an application can add value?
I think that there's no question, and particularly if you're approaching the visual design with an eye towards usability. So a lot of those things that those visual techniques and approaches that we talked about, they're things that are intuitive, or things that can be learned over time. And so an experienced visual designer can certainly take an application, reskin it, and make it better than it was before, just by using solid visual information and interaction design techniques. At the same time, what you lose out there is the ability to go back and reconsider usability or workflow issues that bubble to the surface when you're thinking about the interface. So I personally have experienced going through an exercise of skinning an interface, identifying lots of potential usability pitfalls, and thinking we would be a lot better served if we could address these things at the same time rather than having to come back to them later. So I think there's no question that visual design on its own can add a lot of value, a lot of perceived value. You know, often it's a lot about perception, value in terms of aesthetics and engagement, and also usability. But I think the ideal process is to make sure that we're considering interaction, visual, and user workflows all at the same time.
Thank you for that. Another question we have here is, you mentioned that consistent application of visual styles across an application can help a user learn how to use the application. Is there ever a need to break this consistency because of a particular user need in a given workflow?
So I think yes and no. I think if you wanted to really get someone's attention, for example, think about a medical application where what the provider was getting ready to do would be a life-threatening action, then you certainly want to use visuals to grab their attention, and you want to do so in a way that is very different from what they've been seeing during regular use of the application. But that said, I think you still want to treat those sort of catastrophic notifications similarly when they're given, and then that's probably a whole other webinar there on alert fatigue and why you shouldn't give those things too often. But you know, I think there is probably room for a secondary visual treatment that is aimed at getting people's attention. And I don't know if Raelynn wants to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think effectively what Lee is saying is that sort of special case visual treatments based on user needs can also become part of the system itself. So they just need to be considered, and considered in the context of the system that you're already applying in a consistent fashion. And so if you're breaking a system, you need to do so in a way that is effective, understandable, and actually really fulfilling the user needs.
Another question we have is, for user research, how long does it take to usually run? Is a focus group discussion necessary to achieve this? And finally, can a checklist or guidelines be created?
So, you know, this is the answer to all great questions. It depends. So in terms of user research, how long it takes depends on what kind of research methodology you're using and how many people you want to test with. So let's say, for example, that you want to do some user interviews with 5 or 6 users, and you know, best case scenario, you could probably get that done in a matter of days, 4 or 5 days, especially if you have direct contact with the people that you're trying to interview, if they're easy to schedule, you know, all those sorts of things. If you have to do a lot of recruiting, if you want to talk to a lot of people, if you've got a complex committee of folks that have to approve the kind of questions you're going to ask them, all those things are going to make the process run longer. But a lot of times it helps to schedule those things really close together, because your team is going to get lots of information quickly and be able to digest it. And then you asked about focus groups. You know, I'm personally not a big fan of focus groups because I think they become subject to groupthink, or they can become the victim of one sort of loud person who takes over. So I prefer to do individual, or maybe sometimes even talk to people in very small groups. And then your last part was, can a checklist or guidelines be created? And I'm having to guess a little bit about what you mean, but there are certainly checklists of usability heuristics that you can use as you evaluate your applications or your designs. And that's another thing that the gentleman I mentioned before, Jakob Nielsen, came up with, was a list of 10 usability heuristics. That's a great place to start if you want a checklist.
One more question we have is, any tips for a UX career start? In my country, it's still a fresh domain and there's still very few jobs. Continuing on, is email and landing page design a good training before a real UX job?
So I would say tips would be do a lot of reading. And nowadays there's tons of resources online. If you're familiar with Coursera, they teach courses, you know, free, university level, not for credit, but good stuff around user experience. There's lots of great books out there that you can read. And then, you know, work on user experience exercises that are interesting to you. Like, for example, the other day I got the power bill and I thought, this is so horrible, I just want to redesign it. When you come across something that you that you feel that way about, just take it upon yourself and do a quick design exercise, and then you can start to build up a portfolio, even though you might not really have, clients in user experience yet. And you asked about email and landing page design. Certainly if you want to try your hand at design on those kinds of things, the other piece that I would say add into it is testing. So, and it doesn't have to be super formal. I mean, you can test your designs with people that you know, and just find out, how well can you understand what I'm trying to communicate here? What would you do next? What would this page or email make you want to do? Would it make you want to buy a product, or sign up for a webinar or whatever? So you might kind of have to make your own way, but those are maybe some ideas for how to create a portfolio.
I would also add that if it's a question of that the discipline hasn't really evolved yet where you are, you can look for opportunities in other already established disciplines. So maybe people around you are doing software development, or what's more traditionally considered IT, or maybe people around you are doing marketing or web design, and coming at those already established disciplines with a user experience bend can help you essentially help them evolve to include user experience as part of their established processes.
Okay, well, I think we have answered all the questions that have been asked. We're at the bottom, getting close to the bottom of the hour too. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Appreciate the active questions, and I hope you guys have a good day and the rest of the week. Take care.